Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Jojy.
Welcome back to another episode of The Deconstructed Woman. Today, Elisa Marie and I are going to talk about this idea of adulting and why it seems to be more challenging now than it might have been for our parents' generation. And so just to get us all on the same page, I looked up adulting, and I had read an article a couple weeks ago about this topic and sort of the conversation around, why it's more challenging. And just to put it into perspective, when I Google searched it, it said adulting is more difficult now, primarily due to a severe cost of living crisis, with 71% of people agreeing it is harder today than 30 years ago. And some of the reasons why is stagnant wages, high housing costs, and intense social media comparison create immense financial and mental pressure. And then also constant connectivity causes burnout. And then is there a lack of formal training for practical life skills that may leave many people unprepared? So as Elisa Marie and I were talking about this before we jumped on, Elisa had some immediate thought that came to mind. So I'm going to turn it over to her for her to give us her perspective and jumpstart this conversation.
Yeah, so the two things that came to mind for me were like telephone lines and insurance. And I think that those are two good examples of, you kind of go along and maybe you're on a family plan initially. And then as you get older, I know for me, I was on my parents' family plan until I got married. And then I jumped over to my husband's telephone line, and we created our new family plan, which we have to today. And so, in some ways that there was like a learning curve for doing that. But I think that a lot of younger individuals that I've talked to kind of over the years have said that they're still on their parents' family plan and intend to kind of like bring their spouse in on it just because that's just one less thing they have to worry about. But I think that there's so much that goes into, the independence and that adulting piece of it to be able to have your own phone line when you want to upgrade your phone, being able to do that. I think there's a certain level of independence, but also a certain level of understanding and knowledge that goes into that. And I think it's probably the same for like insurance as well. Like, moving from your parents' insurance to your own. I think all of those are instances where you're doing this transition, but nobody kind of gives you the, exact idea of how to do that. And so you kind of learn by fire.
Yeah. And I do think that there are, this concept of like when you're independent or like the family plan almost insinuates that you have to have a family to have a family plan. And so what does happen, to your point, Elisa, when your kids graduate from college, but maybe they don't have a job yet, or they're in the process of becoming independent and learning how to manage all the bills that come with maybe living in your own, like your first apartment. And when is the right time to sort of launch your kids and make them responsible for some of those expenses, but then everything is starting to come in at the same time. And I can speak to that a little bit because, my kid, when she moved into her own place, I don't think we thought about the phone because in an apartment situation, you're already thinking about utilities and gas and electricity. And so some of that stuff sort of has to be dealt with right away. And there seems to be like a clear path for how to do that. But then how about the other things like car insurance, cell phone usage, health insurance, like you mentioned? Those are a little bit trickier because there's no specific incident that forces that conversation.
Yeah. And I think that I think that there's just so many moving parts to that because like you said, you don't have kind of the idea of where to go with that. And I think that so often a lot of times people say, well, this is too hard. I'm just going to stay on my parents' plan. Like, and if parents are willing to do that, because there is a learning curve that goes with being able to do these things. And I think, now it's kind of become a joke amongst myself and kind of friends. Like when we run into something hard, it's like, oh, we're adulting now. Like we just finished up tax season. I've always had somebody do my taxes. And so this is like another example that came to mind as we were talking. And a lot of my coworkers do their own taxes. And I was like, oh, I've never done my own taxes. But it's getting way too expensive to have somebody else do it. And so I was like, okay, next year I need one of you to sit down with me and kind of walk me through like how to do my own taxes because I've never done it in 41 years. Have, never done TurboTax or anything like that. But at this point in my life, it's just cost effective for me to do it myself. And so I don't know the first thing about it. I don't even know like where to go. Luckily, in this time and age, I have Google to help me like maneuver through that and friends who have done it. But otherwise, I kind of got along with this was easier to have somebody else do my taxes until it became unaffordable.
And I will say that I cannot say today whether my husband is involved with my child's taxes any longer. I know for a while they were working on it together or he did hers, but now I really don't know because given the fact that the taxes were due a couple weeks ago, I don't remember that coming up, like my husband having to connect, with the child to say, hey, how are you doing your taxes? But for many, many years, I know that we did them, he did them, for her. And so that's another example of like, when do you start thinking about that? So given the fact, Alyssa, that you're the only person I know and that age range, like when do you think, given the fact that you went to college and you went to grad school, you met your husband, you got married, like when did that transition sort of start to clearly happen? Like, did you and your husband, before you guys got married, have family plans with your parents? Or did you, when you got married, decide, okay, now this is the inception of our family, so we will start a family plan now together? I guess I don't even really know how that happens.
I mean, I can speak to like kind of how my family did it. I'm thinking that it's probably different per different people's experiences. But like for me, like my father has always been there and he's always said like I will support you until your husband kind of like takes over in some ways. Like that was kind of the mentality of my family. And so a lot of things I mean I went off to college and I lived, my college was like 2 hours away from my parents. So I was living independently. I worked on the college campus, paid my bills, utilities, all of that. Like and I had a scholarship. So like I was pretty much launched in that regard. But again, like insurance, I was on my parents' insurance. And then, my phone was within my parents' family plan. And so I stayed on it for all of that time just because it was easier. I wanted to keep my phone number. I didn't even know that you could keep your phone number and transfer to a different plan. And so there was a lot of learning it. I was like, I don't want to get a new number because this is the number everyone knows. Um, and so, for the longest time, um, my parents would get me like refurbished phones or, kind of I would hand me down phones from like, my mom would get a new phone and I would get hers or something like that. And so it was this kind of progression of I'm gaining more and more independence. But then when I joined with my husband, then it was like, okay, well, you know, my husband's taking over. And so therefore, like, I'm no longer going to be on my parents' plan. Like, that's again the mentality. And that might be like, old school European mentality. I don't know. I don't know who does and doesn't have that mentality. But at that point, we joined together. And then it was like, okay, now you're on your own. And a lot of that felt very challenging at that point because I had relied on my parents, or at least they had kind of been like, I would call my dad and be like, "Hey, how do I do this?" Um, and I remember very distinctly that after my husband and I got married, this is a side story. I was living in an apartment and my car broke down. And I immediately called my dad and was like, "Hey, dad, my car broke down. Like, what should I do?" And he was like, "Oh," and I happened to live at that time about 15 minutes away from him. He's like, "I'll be there in 15 minutes." So he came over, we got a tow truck, and then my husband was like, "Well, I don't think we should move it." And there was this whole like hullabaloo of trying to figure out like where was the best place to push the car so the tow truck could get it. And it was just this whole fiasco. And that was the turning point for me of realizing, okay, when a crisis occurs at this point, like I either there's too many cooks in the kitchen, me and my husband need to figure things out, um, and really kind of focus on what do we want? Not because my dad did anything wrong, like, he was so helpful in that moment, but it was just, like, he was pulling me one direction and my husband's pulling me a different one, and that was, like, I don't wanna keep doing this." So I'm kinda having to do things in a different way, and kinda learn more independence because I don't want to always rely on my father for things.
Yeah, and I was also thinking as you were talking, there have been a couple conversations I've had with my staff that are probably ages like 22 to 25. And as I read a little bit about, when we were introducing this topic and about like the livable wage, I've had conversations with young people who have said, like, I can't move out on this salary. Like thinking about the cost to move out, like this is keeping me at my parents' house because even though I have a profession, the profession isn't going to allow me to afford my car, an apartment, food. And that's just a really difficult conversation because as an employer, I don't know how much I can be responsible for. But at the same time, I see their point because this is not quote unquote a livable wage depending on where you live in. And we're not living in the city of Chicago. We're not living in a very expensive rental area. But at the same time, you need to have a certain monthly income to be able to do all the different things that goes together. So I guess that is something that is challenging. And we've talked before on budgeting and being able to think about, what do you want to have versus need to have? And how do you make those decisions? But, those are real life issues. Recently, I had someone who came and said, with gas going towards $4.50, or more, like if I live 20 miles from work, I can't afford to drive here a round trip every day. And I mean, these are conversations that I have from time to time. And I really don't know where is my accountability and where do I just say, I don't know what to tell you because running a business is also more expensive today. And so these are real life challenges. And I don't know if that's adulting. I don't know if that's the cost of doing business. I don't really know. But at the same time, retention and keeping employees is also really important. And so I don't want to go through all that, attrition and have to recruit and retrain everybody. So it's really a challenge now that I'm thinking about all the different aspects of how this plays out in young people's lives and how that it impacts my life as an employer. So it is very complicated. And I don't know if there's a simple answer to all these questions that we're having.
Well, I know that the conversation about like budgeting and things like that has definitely come up again in like a lot of conversations that I've had with other people. But I do, and I think we've probably talked about it before that, one of the things that has been hard is I'm still trying to figure out like how to budget. And I feel like this is such like an adulting thing is how to budget a family of six, how to make ends meet. And this is something I've been working on and have, bought so many different programs and things and looked at it different ways. But the reality is that it not one size fits all. And so I think that, I don't think I could ever tell my employer that I can't, I can't afford to drive to work. I have to get to work. So, I mean, that for me, I would be like, okay, where can I cut other places? How do I make this work? I do think, kind of to your point, is that there has to be some accountability put on the person to say, okay, if this is a priority to you, then you figure out how to make that work. And if if it's not a priority to you, maybe you don't make it work. But I think that it is hard, and inflation is real, and there are financial challenges now that I don't think that we had 30 years ago. But at the same time, we had the Great Depression. We had these times where people were financially strapped, and they did have it. It was very challenging, and yet people still got through. So I don't know. I might be like people, I might agitate somebody, and I apologize for that. But like, the point being that I think that you have to kind of take that accountability for yourself too.
So the other thing I was thinking about when you were talking is that before we jumped on, we talked about how the age of being on your parents' insurance is now 26. And the individuals I'm thinking about, that is also involved with them. So I believe that they are on their parents' insurance. And because insurance is so expensive, it's so much more financially beneficial for them to stay on their family's insurance, which in these two particular situations, they also live at home with their families. And both of them live far away from where we were. And so there's this idea of, well, if you didn't live with your family, I mean, it's like a vicious cycle. Like, if you have to move out on your own, then you have to be able to and live closer. Then you are more responsible for your own, cost of the different things, and gas will go down. But then maybe your rent is now, now you're going to pay rent, and you've got to be responsible for food and other things. So it is a trade-off, but it's hard because I feel like sometimes the adulting conversations then puts the onus on the employer to be like, okay, so you figure it out. And I'm like, how does this become my problem? Because there's only so much I can do. But at the same time, I also see like, okay, I can see where they're coming from, because if I was on my parents' insurance till 26, but here's the thing, as soon as my child got a full-time job, but they were also lucky because they worked for a large company, and so it was less expensive for them to go out on their own than me to cover them on my insurance. So I was just sort of like, hey, honey, you need to, sort of go on your own, because it's actually more economical for you to go on your own. I didn't offer to pay for the insurance because it would have been cheaper for me to pay for their insurance than keep them on my insurance. But at that point, I think that was sort of like, okay, well, you have a full-time job, and I don't even know if they were living on their own or not at that point, if they were still living here. But it was just like, I guess it's a process of, I don't know, being launched or individuation where some of these things come up. Now, I will tell you that we were the family that I recommend this for every family to do. And I think in these areas, very few families do it, which is to have their children start paying for car insurance and pay for, car maintenance, because I think that is something that, in terms of keeping up with the Joneses out here, where we have a lot of families that supplement their children's cars and their gas money and their spending money, which I will say that we did not do. My kid had to do that, for themselves. And there was a little bit of resentment. There was a lot of resentment at different times. But I feel like by the time they got to college, it really helped them understand what we were trying to accomplish. And I remember, I think it was in high school as a senior, they had to take a class about there was this class about home economics or budgeting or something. And most of the people in their class did not know anything about what your monthly budget is. And because my child was doing that, they absolutely knew what their insurance cost, what their gas costs were, what they paid for their car, because as a senior in high school, they'd actually basically financed 60% of their car from their jobs that they had. And although there was resentment about having to do that because the kids that they went to school with didn't have to worry about that, I just kept saying, like, this will serve you well. Like, this was something my family did for me and it helped me. And did my parents keep me on their insurance until I got married? Absolutely. Was I probably, I don't know if I had a cell phone back then. I don't think I did. But like, if they would have kept me, because I grew up in a family very similar to yours, Alyssa. My dad was, sort of the primary caretaker until the responsibility, quote unquote, of me being a part of another family or joined a husband. I mean, that was like the division of, okay, then I'm leaving this family. So very much so, my dad and mom took care of me until I became independent or, became married. And so it wasn't like I got abandoned, but I think that there was this idea of, you should be independent. You should know how to do that. You should understand the cost of living and what it means so that you understand when you're making some decisions about, what degree are you going to pursue or how many, fun hobbies or activities can you do in one time. And I don't know if those conversations are not happening anymore, but I feel like definitely from, my child's perspective, that wasn't put upon in high school for my kid because they definitely felt like other kids had it a lot better and that we didn't need to, like that was something that they had to think about before they felt like their friends had to deal with. But I still stand by the fact that I think it was the best way to raise a child today. And I will say that, um, you know, catch up to the story now, my kid is going to be almost 30 years old in a couple of weeks. And they really haven't struggled with adulting. I feel like they've done a pretty good job with being able to do that, but they've also managed their money since they were probably 15, 16 years old. Not 100%, but I would say every year it got more and more over time.
Yeah, and I would say that I agree with the fact that, that's at least that's my game plan for my kids. Because I was thinking when you were talking about earlier, I was thinking about car insurance and upkeep and maybe like, contributing to the phone bill or groceries or whatever it may be. Like especially my kids are already taught. I mean, my oldest is 11, but she was like, "When can I get a job?" She already kind of identified what she wants to do in the summers, and I said, "That's great." And so she kind of knows, this is what I plan on doing when I get to this age. And the first thought that I had was that's awesome because then, you can have your own money to go and do things. And the kids have been starting to learn that at these very young ages. My two oldest are 11 and almost 9, and they got money from Christmas and they'll ask me to take them to the store, and then if they find something that they want and they don't have enough money, I said, "Oh, well, you'll have to wait till next time and see if you can earn a bit more money or wait till after your birthday or whatever it is." And I don't just jump in. Sometimes I do because I'm like, "Oh, they really want it and I don't know if they'll be here next time." But for the most part, I try to kind of impart on them, you know, managing their own money and they can buy what they want, and I don't stop them. And if they use their money and buy a bunch of candy and then it's gone and they're like, "Oh, I don't have any more money," that was a learning experience for them. So I do think that there are ways to kind of foster that. And again, I think there's probably different ways of looking at it, but I do think that that is part of helping a child to launch to adult because without that foundation of kind of how do I manage this, I think a lot of times you just kind of the other part of it that I was thinking is I trial and error was how I learned a lot of things. My husband and I, again, there's when it came to finding a good mechanic, I didn't know how to find a good mechanic. We looked at reviews. We had a couple that did some stuff that uh impacted the car, and so we're like, okay, this didn't work. And so, we finally kind of landed on a good mechanic for our car that we trust and that we can work with. And I remember my dad's had the same mechanic for probably 40, 50 years, that always works on his cars and does things for him. And so I think it's about kind of learning, what does that look like? What do I want this to look like? And then trying to like trial and error till you get that. And so I think it's a whole process to learn certain things, and that also comes with failing or making mistakes and being okay with that. Hopefully not a mistake that, financially harms you or physically harms you, but I think that there's just a lot of learning that happens when you're young and you have to kind of figure out what's the best way to make this work, how do I do this, and kind of going from there.
Yeah, I think, the other thing I will say is that, we don't, we all have friends, I believe, I do, who, supplement their kids' income or, do more than they can. And I do worry about that because I do think about, when, are these the people that, you hear about like, oh, your mother or sister who never like fully launched or, like it never became independent, or they end up you have to take them in because they never really figured out how to do this. And I just don't know if, with successive generations, if that is going to be something that is commonplace, or is the expectation that we are going to be independent. I'm definitely of the mindset that I'm not going to take care of anybody in my elder years. Like, I'm not going to be like, yeah, come on, come live with me, and have some financial burden for somebody else's living expenses. That is no plan of mine at all. And I say that very honestly to, the people in my family, because I didn't raise my child that way to be dependent on me. And so, but I do wonder, like, the one thing we didn't talk about, Alyssa, is, and I feel like you might be a little bit closer to this because social media has really had its rise, with your generation. But do you feel like there is a reality of sort of social media pressure to have the bells and whistles that young people or TikTok is advertising? Like, do you feel like there is definitely some pressure to do stuff like that, which could be adding to maybe some of the problems that, I don't know, future generations may encounter?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely do think that social media plays a significant role in kind of skewing how things should be. And I think that I have personally had to kind of counteract that in some ways. So, you know, um, you see everybody, and I think, something that was hard for me is when I see specifically, like, families, like, going on trips and doing stuff, and I'm like, "Oh, why can't I do that? Like, why can't I like, that should, be such an easy thing." Like, I wanna I've talked about, like, I wanna take my kids to Disney World, and it's so hard because, 1, Disney World gets more and more expensive when we're talking about budgeting, but also, like, I just it's just not something we can do right now. And so when I see different advertisements or things, I think it really kind of pulls me, and I'm like, well, we could just throw it on the credit card and call it a day. But that's not financially where we want to go. And so I think that seeing those things on a daily basis, because think about it, 30 years ago, there wasn't social media. You heard about, through the grapevine that somebody was going on a trip or something, but you didn't see people. Like, I mean, I probably have upwards, I don't know, 400 friends on Facebook, which are people from high school, people from, my show choir in high school, college friends, like people that I don't actually really associate with. Like, I could message them and talk to them if I wanted to, but like, not they're not in my close inner circle. But I have all these people that I see what they're doing in their lives, and it's like half of them I don't even need to know what's going on. But I think that that's probably pretty typical for most people. And Instagram, TikTok, they're all the same. They're kind of set up the same way, that your friends are following people that you're not necessarily close with, but you now have a front row seat to what's going on in their life. And, they're posting these different things. And so there are more pressures of the sense of I need to be doing this, or maybe I not doing this right, or whatever it could be. I mean, it's such a vast topic of discussion. But I think because of that, we do have kind of this skewed perception of how things are supposed to be.
And I do empathize with those individuals that, because I feel like on one hand, over the test of time, people have always wanted more than they could have, or, like they have to work for something, or some people always had more than other people. And so you always had, that peer pressure is not something new, but the intensity of the peer pressure definitely feels like it changed. For sure. I think even just watching, my my daughter go through that. And now my grandson who said, I want to go to this indoor playground because all my friends go there. And so that was like something that, I think as adults, we felt like we needed to take him there so that in preschool or elementary school, he can feel like he fits in with everybody. So I think that there's always ways that we can feel that way. And I would say that I know it's an issue. I know that the young people that I've talked to who want to move on with their lives but feel like they're stuck, there's also this frustration that comes with it. And we won't solve for that today. But I do want our listeners to know that we do have empathy for it. We do understand, like it feels overwhelming. It feels like everything is set up against them. But at the same time, there was a day that I felt like that too. And I felt like, especially, graduating with a master's degree and having to pay that off, but also knowing that the career I chose is not going to land me in a high income job anytime. And I had to figure out how to make that work. It's the same problem, just 30 years later, right? So I feel like it's different, but it's the same. And we all get there. We all figure it out. You're not going to be in the same boat 25 years from now. So there's hope. It's just that you can't have everything, and you need to make some very specific decisions, and you need to be somewhat strategic, and you need to, get some good advice, trust some people, ask questions, learn, get referrals for a good mechanic if you're going to have an older car that needs to survive. There are just things that you have to do. But you're not going to be able to get a new car, every 5 years. You're not going to get a new phone every 2 years. You're not going to be able to go on big trips. You're not going to be able to. These are just the realities of our life. I don't know if I'm being a naysayer, Alyssa, but I think I'm just sort of realistic.
Yeah, I think that there's just so much. I think the word that I kind of gravitated towards is launching. And I think that in some ways, younger generations are launching later. And I can even say that for my own generation. Like I got married and had kids later in life. I think there's probably statistics that indicate that. And so that launching process now just feels that much harder. And I think that's kind of bringing us full circle to kind of where we started from this point. So adulting is the topic, but that it's adulting launching into adulthood and being able to know where to go. And I think that there is the possibility that the parents can help their children to try to do that. We gave some examples of how, you had done that, how I plan to do that. So that hopefully, our the next generation has the ability to launch maybe a little bit sooner. But I think that each kind of generation has their own challenges, and each one looks different of what that whole launching process is because of that. So I think that it's a this is probably, like you said, a longer conversation, or a jumping off point for more. But I think that there's a lot here that people can relate to, whether you are in your early 20s and about to launch yourself, or are kind of in like midlife, and still figuring out like I am. I think that everybody kind of has a different perspective, and all of it together collectively is challenging in its own way.
Well, I think that leads us to the end of the conversation. And so, yeah, I mean, for our listeners, do you have feedback for us? Do you disagree with us? Do you think we're being too harsh? Or do you think that, we're being practical on sort of on the spot? So, you can reach out to us at any time. You can reach out through our Facebook page, through the platform where you listen to us. And if you know us individually, you can reach out to us through the other ways that you get a hold of us. But thank you so much for taking the time to listen in today on this conversation. It is a difficult topic depending on what age you are. And sometimes even if you are older and you're watching your kids and your grandkids go through this, who are now adulting or struggling to adult, everybody has an opinion, I'm sure, and we'd love to hear about it. So until next time, thank you so much for tuning in. And we look forward to hearing from you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you liked this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.